Hello everyone, today we conclude our Catholic Orthodox Eastertide period reflection on Christianity in late antiquity. This mini-series received a substantially large amount of attention because of the relatively contentious object and also the general sense that these ideas are still fundamentally at the center of our identity, spiritual, even ethnic debate, right? And in the topics comment down below, you will find essentially the first two episodes, even though I haven't numbered them because this wasn't technically even a series. It was just like a single episode that took 3 videos to finish. I'm not even sure technically that today I'm going to conclude it because the topic is really big. However, if you have watched the previous 2, also if you are acquainted with my work in general, you know that especially in this episode, essentially we have looked at, so in these videos, we have looked at the sort of more common ideas, mostly misconceptions existing on the role of Christianity and the meaning of Catholicism, more importantly, that cause such great debate. One can start right off the bat from what, it's not like we have been beating around the bush, but let's say that there is this major understanding we addressed, especially in the first video, namely that in spite of the contemplative height that we see in late antiquity with Stoicism, Neoplatonism, etc., sustaining on essentially only a solitary flame amid an accelerated dissolution of morals, of metaphysical standards, of ecumenic power, etc. In fact, in the previous videos we have pointed out that this has always been my position, by the way. I've on this channel never denied that what happened in late antiquity was fundamentally a positive thing. However you want to look at it. I'm not specifically referring to Christianity, but the wall, right? But Christianity was also largely a consequence of. And that is to say, the cyclical era's collapse, right? Subsequent collapse, era after era of such standards, and as a consequence, also in the elite element ruling the empire after the great peak of the Augustan era, and so its golden age character, the fact that a contemplative rather than a more action-based attitude towards divinity had occurred. This is a simplistic interpretation, meaning that, say, the actualization of the self, obviously enough, actually does require contemplation to a degree. It's never pure action. In tradition, action is an action that is truly self-actualizing, is heavily informed by a spiritual awareness that does derive in the moment from that contemplative achievement. So one could go even as far as saying that, say, if contemplation take us on a sort of slower and more, in fact, fatigue pace, so action really does. One cannot look at late antiquity and say, well, the late Roman Empire was actually weak in absolute terms, and we have really discussed this very often on the channel, what happened to the West was basically just an evaporation of power, as if locally there weren't powers in the wake of the previous Roman administration. Most of these lands actually remained Romance and Roman in so many ways. The Germans injected a very important, albeit still minority, element that eventually perfectly blended, syncretized with those countries. Again, post-Roman Europe in particular, that remained. In fact, in West also the most powerful, and as we've seen in other videos, even compared with the Mediterranean East, actually more qualitative force. We have made all those videos, introspective, sort of psychoanalytical Q&As regarding the fact that Gaul and Italy alone likely equated in scale the entire Byzantine East at different points. I'm not here to discuss that because here we're really just discussing late antiquity per se. Why do I say this? Because if we get a picture of mere dissolution, of evaporation, of vacuum, we are falling into a historical interpretation that fundamentally did not exist up to a few hundred years ago, and that fundamentally was stimulated by some progressistic, modernistic, kind of, very often also anti-Catholicistic, truly also in a universal sense, anti-papistic in a more strictly religious fashion, interpretation that whatever had been after the nominal rule of a Roman state, as opposed to the Holy City of Rome, that still maintained by far the upper hand spiritually on the entire West, and was keeping to evangelize and to spread the Romanity throughout all the period, and unstoppably, like during the ensuing Middle Ages. You are, in fact, essentially self-hating. There's no way to, I think, around that. Like, if you are, this is not mere ignorance, right? Say if you're ignorant, as it's actually and unfortunately normal today in basic Western European history, in say early medieval times, high medieval times, you're not able to quantify, eyeball, substantiate civilizational quantities. It's not okay, but it's still something that it's obvious. Like, if you don't have a very specific education or quantity of education, you can't really fundamentally embrace on your own. You truly need a specific education. You really need someone that takes you out of that, makes you see things from a higher level. But when, in fact, you are essentially even radically, and this sounds like a very gnostic, dualistic mentality. Like, if you need to conceptualize it, basically there was no such a thing like the same level of power that is exclusively of divine origin in all tradition. And you need basically to cross an entire civilization out, in some cases that are pretty strong to it, were always to a degree in post-traditional times. Because you're looking at Christendom as such, we have a very big problem. Because it's not about denying the lower force that overall the world, not just this was not happening in the West, was happening all across the board in Eurasia and beyond. That was a civilizational exhaustion, so many different universal basins. You're pretending to force an interpretation of history that is either in or out, black or white, being or not being. And this is not actually the case. This is not the case in tradition already, because the problem is inherent to the fall. Earthly power also continues with an overtly, explicitly Holy Roman Imperial and Catholic tradition all across the entirety of Europe. And it doesn't make any sense as a general point, like to say, well, okay, well, I will just stop studying history when Christianity comes, or I will essentially characterize Christianity as something completely alien or separated from the same Catholic universal belief that existed all across the world at the time. And you need to accentuate that essentially because you hate the world in which you live, in a way or another, or at least you attribute to Christianity. Very often never heard a person that actually provided with a convincing, overarching explanation of all of this, as we have countless times on Schwerpunkt as well. This is not for Christianity, it could be anything else. Other people would simply make the point it was... there are many factors I want to derail on them. It can be culture, it can be racial, it can be political, by different degrees, right? That evidently no person agrees on, as it's sort of very easy to browse. Just ask, what's the worldview of a single person. There's no two people that think actually the same, right? So to even push certain narratives in general as this is the game solver, this is what, say, the simple dichotomy that no historian has ever been able to sort of demonstrate, and positively so. I mean, I don't pretend to do it, even if when I have megalomaniacal ambitions, right? I am able to recognize that in order to understand these things, it takes like such an advanced level of absolute awareness that in fact coincides with pure traditional wisdom, which is something by definition superhuman, and that it's a bit difficult to find in any community in the world, especially nowadays. So these are all dialectical premises that could undermine any sort of hard take, especially against Christianity as some sort of, again, of Semitic pollution of the sort of the sacred Aryan space in Europe. And just indeed that there is a lot of influence of that in what was in fact a quite different European identity. There's nothing to deny, to criticize per se. The question is by which degree and by which declension, because even if you go back to hardcore traditionalists, fascist mystics, whatever, like the interpretation was not in fact so linear ever. Even people that were overtly hating Jews, for example, and attributing to Christianity this kind of foreign character that would have, in the sense, allegedly brought per se, just to the collapse of a civilization, actually admitted to the fact that either they didn't believe that sometimes, but they either they even came to realization that, yeah, at the end of the day, it's your own sin, it's your own pride. This is not a Christian message per se. I understand that obviously Christianity, in a broader cultural sense, today is the only place where you hear this from because you don't study anything else. And generally speaking, the better society you know is Christian, that obviously is aware about sin, etc. But this is the same point that you read in all Indo-European theology texts. What is the greatest enemy? The greatest, it's fear, right? And it's the burden, the cumulative burden of sin, the lack of self-actualization into divinity, and so into transcendence. You can find this in Buddhism. You can find this in Zoroastrianism. This is not just a Christian thing, or it's not even a particularly sort of sinfully ridden concept in a strictly emotional or pathetic sense, like in Christianity, that actually invites you exactly to, the entire point of Christianity is to surpass that emotionalism, to surpass that pathetism. And people confuse sometimes, even basically in the history of religions later, also in the same medieval Christianity, for example, the mystical element as some sort of emotionalistic one, whereas others see, in fact, mysticism as the highest sort of spiritual tension, predisposition, as opposed to rationalism, to try to make sense. And that is also inherently risky, because it also excludes the completion that both elements of the spectrum should bring. Like the division is not on a horizontal plan, it is about elevation of thinking and or lack thereof in an existential sense. So Rome, this is a position that was held by different authors. You have asked me recently about Ebola. That definitely was a pretty interesting author and heavily discussing these things. Having once severed Rome, the Roman Empire, so the broader ecumene, having once severed herself from her primordial Atlantic and Etrusco-Pelasgian moorings, systematically dismantled the principal centers of this southern Mediterranean civilization of the mother that had basically started to retake over after the Indo-European conquests, because the various Indo-Europeans, italics included, had started to fall once again prey of this samsara and general chthonic sort of feminine element. I made multiple videos about this for that matter. The Romans had essentially, this is a deeply underrated aspect of the saying, the fact that the Romans essentially inverted this trend, and that, especially in the destruction of Carthage in an archetypal sense, displayed the triumph of a virile solar, truly Uranian spirituality over this dark, like chthonic, maternally led and in this sense, feminine, like you see also the archetype in the same Aeneid, as a matter of fact, force, that was once again retaken in the Mediterranean. This is very interesting because if you look at Phoenician spirituality, there is obviously also a virile element that, however, gets definitely dismantled to a degree in the inclination of mythology. It's true that Levantine spirituality was tendentially more defeatistic, right, about the divine transcendence of the hero and so on. Naturally, as we've seen, there were elements within the same Rome that had remained unavoidably in the hierarchical, corporate, traditional world of the time, subjected, in fact, in the lower elements. It's like today we look at the communists, right, and all those strata of society that embrace that kind of tendential attitude. And it can't be, it's not like, maybe not even Marxists or communists themselves in a conscious sense. They think maybe that they're heroes or but they have that inclination, right? Even maybe from affluent backgrounds, etc., towards a more indulgent, tolerant, and in the sense defeatistic, like sort of idling mentality, right? And interestingly enough, Rome, we talk about Atlantic and Etrusco-Pelasgian. This is a terminology, for example, taken from Evola, notoriously enough. And the idea, we will talk about this better, we have to still talk about Hyperborean sort of mythology in a broader sense. Then essentially this is the idea that from there, that the race of heroes passes to Atlantid and then to basically to Europe, where it encountered this other elements of that had developed Mediterranean, of other races that had fallen at other times. That's essentially the metaphysical description was given to this. And in fact, I made a video about the Etruscans that likely had an Indo-European origin from Anatolia, but that had acquired a great deal of that Pelasgian, that is to say, broadly speaking, chthonic Mediterranean sea kind of, in the sense, more actually telluric, because the sea is actually even more chthonic, paradoxically, than the same earth, right? Character, after having dwelled, in fact, there in the east, have been becoming morally corrupt, right? We explained how in Etruscan religion there is all the potentially fully fledged patriarchal Indo-European-oriented sense of gods that rule over the world because of their achievement, etc. But then there are the so-called dei involuti, that is the Latin term that from, in fact, Roman literature describing the Etruscans, that were basically literally occult deities that loomed over these other ones, such as the Olympians, right, and that spread a sense of despair and of fear and terror that also went along with, in fact, the Etruscan fear of death, in a more chthonic sense of, same life and connection with this netherworld. Think about the also beautiful Etruscan necropolis, this, however, already indulge in this material, heavy, sort of very contemplative, iconistic kind of spirituality. And we know also from our videos that Rome conquers them in a way that is fully integral with the sense properly of traditional power, namely not destroying these peoples, but essentially drawing the power from them, being able to tame them, to possess this great mother, to truly redeem her in the symbol that is still, by the way, in Christianity, the one of the Virgin, that in fact stands on the half crescent, and as we've seen in the videos about Hermetic tradition, is the angel woman, is Victory herself. And the Virgin Mary, in the sense, is not different from a Juno, Regina in Latin, right? Or a Hera, right? That is, yes, it is the feminine element par excellence, but it's also the redeemed one, and not some fury from the netherworld, whatever, right? Because this power is fully integrated now into the hero's lordship, right? In their marriage, right? And so, indeed, the Romans, explaining how Rome did this, like if you want to explain the rise of Rome, to begin with, it's impossible to do in any other sort of historical context in a deterministic sense. Right, studying history of spirituality seems much more useful for the purpose, and at the same time, really revealing of the necessity of will to power in order to explain any change. Like even for materialists, like the question is, how do you actually explain life at that point? How do you think that a stone eventually determines what people do simply because it's there? Where, like, how does this person interact, and who does do what, like, just because of that stone? There is evidently something else, right? One can go back and forth to this game until one realizes that indeed, if anything, they're all one with one another, and that it's impossible even to distinguish the cause from the effect, vice versa, right? Whichever side you take, right? So evidently, materialism does not explain conscience per se, or at least would like to do it, but the question is that we just truly don't know from a strictly sort of conventionally scientific point of view. But leaving this aside, and as if it even mattered really, when you look at these are big statements in a historical sense, obviously, because again, philosophy calls us into question in trying to determine which was born first, the hen or the egg or whatever. But the question is also, what do we know as people? What do we see in others, right? How much can we control things? There are many instances that defy this proposition that simple availability is what eventually does things. In any case, Rome had been quite iron-fisted in her, if anything, dominion affirmation. We explained the difference between regere and imperare. Telling the truth, Rome was, in the sense, much more magnanimous and offered a much greater degree of redemption. Think about the manumissio. And so the idea that the power of the hero is so great that it can transcend even the sins of those he conquers. So Pythagorean communities, Bacchic rites, Alexandrian divinities were at different times outlawed, resisted, properly blocked, especially up until the late Republic. There was a sense that even though Rome always acted as a great feudal hierarchy in terms of spiritual leadership, obviously, as we just said, Rome could afford to rule over peoples that were less in this sense, and given a form, right, an order, an authority, a discipline to the world that remain, in fact, to our very day. There is also a resistance against the excess. There is a resistance against everything that can perturb this incredibly delicate balance of providential essence that maintains this great Holy Roman Imperial Catholic power. The sacral, patrician, virile order, grounded in use, fuss, and ancestral moss, now yielded, however, in late antiquity, gradually to what is historically perceived as chaotic incursions of Asiatic cults, Latin literature being replete of this, especially, in fact, from the early empire onwards, where the more conservative Roman Italics naturally looked at this, especially this freedmen from like, the Syrian. There is this sense of the Levant, right? That surely Christianity was fully within from that Western perspective, regardless of the fact that indeed also the Jews had been particularly influenced by sort of Hellenism, by different concepts also of Iranian matrix and so on, while maintaining, of course, their own Semitic stock in spirit and in culture. And it's difficult not to see, obviously, in the history of the Roman Empire, this gradual dissolution, the fact that in any sort of civilizational collapse, there are forces of chaos that cause that, right? Paradoxically, this is often given that most criticism today seems to travel on a racial basis. If you really look at the so-called barbarians, you realize that more or less they were doing the same things, right? That their same spirituality in Arianism, for example, as opposed to Catholicism, is quite relevant because it's actually not heroic at all. It actually resembles very much Protestantism later on. It was a destructive force of the unitary rule that, however, did so not through a sort of spiritual deification of these actors, but actually through a prevalent sense that, for example, in the Arian form of Christianity, Jesus was not divine, right? And there was this radical emphasis in the hypostasis, in the separation between heaven and earth, right? So, indeed, while the Germanic chieftains were, in their own regard, a bit like the same Roman senators into a more Apollonian, Uranian sense of their Vodanic descendants, that matched perfectly with the entire, again, universal message. They perfectly knew what that meant for the Romans with Jupiter, or for the Hellenists with Zeus. Like, it was, they, again, all these are cousin peoples. They stem from the same identical ethnocultural mold in a strictly political and historical sense. In this sense, the spiritual horizon was much more homogeneous than we tend to think. The lesser elements of this mechanism are truly civilization-hating elements, right? So when people lash at figures like Paul of Tarsus, that indeed was also, if you read his work, like there is within the quite plurally complex Christian background, but lots of positions that are borderline, are heterodox, are something, the Saint Luther essentially derives from a tradition that had emphasized mostly St. Paul and St. Augustine as opposed to other apostles and fathers of the church. So the question is much more complicated from that dualistic, sort of monofactorial even side of the story, right? One could say, but the Levant did not produce at this point any further push, however, that could revive the empire. Well, yes, in a broader sense, yes, never as much as the Germans would. That there is no doubt about this. And actually, a great part of the difference between Latin Germanic Christendom and the Byzantine Oriental one tends to form also on those ethnocultural bases and differences, right? So that there is no doubt, but also the Slavs, for example, fit largely the Orthodox idea. And even there, the Orthodox maintain, as you know, some greater sense that's of Sebastocratic rule, that fundamentally lay authorities are actually sacred in themselves if they still maintain the standards of heroism, but until they can control the church. But this actually spirals down in the moment of collapse of humanity. At that point, especially by the first millennium AD, that was the product of further decadence from the previous centuries, the previous millennium, depending on how you want to see it. That's also a perspective is often not pushed, because before there were others in charge, yes, but they were still humans and still things went down the line. They collapsed, just as the Muslims collapsed. The Muslims embraced that essentially Iranian-derived kind of sense of holy war. And in this sense, also Islam is, regardless of the fact that it's illiterate in the Trinity, it does not understand. It has sort of a greater, more totalizing concept of God, but it's still more like a sort of Semitic submission to it. And yes, it's colored in blood and holy struggle, etc. But the question is, the Muslims do not even develop the priesthood, and as soon as they sort of exhaust their initial conquering rash, they fragment in a much more myriadic horizon landscape than even the later Christians after the Reformation would. So the question is not what standards you have to hold, because this is what kids today mostly are indoctrinated in, is whether you're actually worth it. Right, and this is obviously because we live in a world of lesser people, and the first thing that a lesser person wants at absolute cost is to distract others from their own inferiority. And so if they say, We're part of a group, and we just feel as that. But I still don't have to do anything but sharing memes and clips about the SS and whatever. And there is evidently no squadrism or fascism out there. The question is, what kind of standards do you actually have? What are your weapons? What is your... even communists back in the day, not even talking fascists in comparison, went out there in the streets up to not even 100 years ago, and they killed one another pretty actively. Where are you in all of this? Like, what is your standard? How are you even worth thinking that you are worth of any trace of divinity? Like, you have to prove it with quality. If you don't have any quality, if you are unaccomplished, but not somebody else's fault, that's a superstition. That's very much like the same attitude that many Christians, as many people in the world at any time, had in terms of it's somebody else's fault. I just hope that if I follow this superstition, something will come to me because somebody will do something about it. This is not what actually Christianity is. This is not obviously what Catholicism is. But since you don't know either of them, and especially the latter, it's a bit complicated to go anywhere with that as well. So indeed, and this is, I've been vocal about this at other times in history, that I talk about history concerning Schwerpunkt at this point, given it's several years, and we've seen things happen. But I reiterated that indeed Christianity contained these chaotic and destructive elements. Right. The problem is what were these? Where were these located in the hierarchy of Christianity? It's a bit difficult to look at the Roman Church and to claim things like, this was pursuing some communistic Demetrian cult just because, I don't know, it claimed like that all people had the same potential, which is very different from saying, that this is communism. The true communists were exterminated by the Catholic Church at the time, if you look at the Catholics, etc. Or, a feminine element where the imminent symbol of the church is the transfigured holy woman, right? Not different from the Valkyries, from Victoria, from Nika. And this is a symbol that remains prepotently. The Virgin slaying, in that sense, the serpent, the Turk. So again, it's a bit difficult to make the case that Christianity doesn't fit a Catholic pattern without even mentioning like the conception of Romanity as also as a papal monarchy and ecumenic hierarchy and so on, right? So what was happening in late antiquity is indeed a reemergence of maternal symbols. Where is acquainted not just with history of religion at the time, but also with art. There is a strong Oriental, Hellenistic. We say Hellenistic because, again, that's also what we're habituated to attribute this to as a broader world, but also that had happened to the Greeks in the same identical way, like with Alexander's conquest and eventually his gradual fall, right, from grace, literally, after having conquered the Persians and then being conquered by the Romans in turn. So it's these cyclical waves, always provided that, again, cyclicity is maybe a bit too... it's not much Spenglerian per se, but something that does not plastically renders how these moral waves actually occur. A heartbeat is much more... it's with a next aging, it seems to me a much better metaphor for that matter. And so you have these turbid, mystical, pantheistic forms, for example, that are typical of Chthonic cults that had drifted far from the luminous clarity of original Demetrian religion and affecting the world as a whole. Again, it's the world that gets into that. It's not an external element to humanity. Remember what we just said about it. Somebody else's fault. Well, if you try to explain history like that, well, it's going to be a bit difficult to get anywhere. So these influences corroded the private mores, the inner virtus, and public institutions alike, ultimately hollowing out the very concept of imperial authority, at least to some extent. We say this because indeed there is in late antiquity, as you know, almost over representation of the heroic character of emperors in times where these were at times barely ruling, a portion of the empire, were doing so just for a few years before getting assassinated by their own troops. So indeed there is a discrepancy between what was understood already at the time as the necessity, look at the Illyrian emperors, that's the era we're talking about, to revive that older tradition, and that the same actors failed at doing for different reasons. And also, again, to explain this, perhaps we need other videos. But we can say that the sacral dimension of emperorship persisted formally, which in tradition is actually what matters the most, at least compared to mere substance. And this is in part, or in all, well, especially institutionally wise, politically wise, what differs differs with post-traditional times in which we live. Right? Today, we completely abandon the notion that there is a form handed down by through tradition that can be properly reimitated, or at least that can provide a path to reactivation. Right? You have a broader sense of sacred, of duty, of morals, whatever, but it's mostly like a lay culture. A lay cult, we would say better. It's something like, I don't know, it's just like it feels like doing like this, it's kind of works. And to some extent, it is even true, meaning that the civilization that we have in mind is truly something we inspire to and that has traditional elements. In fact, there isn't really anything that works that is not traditional by a degree. But the set, properly of wisdom that was used at the time, for example, with initiatic cults, etc., to properly reactivate that traditional awareness is gone right now. People don't use that. Even people who brag about, I don't know, we're recovering, I don't know, hedonism already. It works to a degree that reflects, however, the social cultural misery of our world, and that should make us pose much greater questions about our current condition, rather than pretending that you can't simply jump into a set of activities and you'll actually make it into a degree of transcendence. It's very difficult to do that. We all have our ways, and much of the problem is actually don't even try. How much of us are willingly going to war, for example? Like if you, for example, cross that out from your existence, it's a bit difficult even to claim that you have a clear understanding, even of tradition itself. And it's painful because it literally shows the weakness of humanity. So there is a big deal of hatred at this point in pop culture, in a section of it. There is a great awe, as we explained, towards the Byzantine world. And this is actually still part of self-sabotage in as much as it's done by some, at least, against the West. As you know, I've always had a great love for Byzantine civilization. I've always tried to study as much of its history as I could. Back at university, I made hundreds of videos about Byzantine history and culture. However, right, I also sort of discovered how people tend to use it, and that's what has sort of appeared like a major red flag to me, and therefore I try to balance these things out by explaining a bit better these differences as well, right? There are people who instead just reject Christianity to core, and so even when or especially even when we look at figures like Constantine, Theodosius, etc., or they better, tend to just cross them out as, I don't know, I don't hear this narrative very much, like the fact that these were people that had a more of an Eastern mentality or whatever. However, it's more like, okay, that's Christianity, we don't care. We're not interested. As I was just saying, also the Byzantine world has issues on its own, and it is the same one that in fact maintains a bit in a sclerotic way this idea of transcendence for lay rulers even, that should have maintained that degree of actual sacredness. So to incarnate some sort of priesthood themselves as warriors. And so the priesthood should have been just something that helped the emperor achieve, which is an idea that actually continues in the West as well, because it's not sort of even, it's just redrawn with a different balance in the Christian world. But it's in this sense, especially in the early days or in the early centuries of Christianity, or actually of the Christian Empire even, not so distant even from the original sense that the emperor was truly the guy that you had to support, to bet on, so to say, but with active participation, etc., together with the public cult, etc. So Christianity also moved away from that towards a more opposition between the emperor and the church, and for reasons that are connected with the attitude of both, but that still actually functioned very and much better than what you see in the East, where you don't have that competition. It's all already sclerotized. Again, the Muslims try to mix the two things because they think they have standards. Instead, those standards do not exist anymore at that point in history, and they are much more politically crippled and destabilized by this. So it's and there are different cycles, and then you have injections of different waves of conquest, etc. So it's not just religion, as I was saying before. There's not just one explanation, but it's all baked in the same thing. Now, politically, the late empire pursued ever greater absolutism and homogenization, if you look at it. This is also undeniable, right? Power became much more authoritarian, which actually did not align with the race of the without kings that the Romans had historically been. So there are different ways to divine power. It can be a chosen bunch that is still hierarchically organized, but they're sort of similar. And they're also free, as free men in arms and noblemen at the same time. So there is a way to freedom in an absolute sense among people that is not communism. Communism is just being the poorest blip at the bottom. You can ascend in a corporative sense as a whole people to heaven. This is what the Romans had incarnated. And some of this actually survives in some parts of, especially of the West historically. The tribal world also has that inertia, but as we were saying about the Germans, they weren't the ones that created the Roman Empire, not that sort of were able to maintain it pretty well. But that's a way to it, for example. But again, because time passes, things got worse for everybody, right? Also, the early Germans truly believed at some point, even though we don't have enough history about them in those early days, that, of course, the hero could save himself and, triumph and conquer the world. But already by the time of Christ and the Germans that we get to know later, so like they had already lost that sense that they could make it alone, right? And we'll come back on this, looking at the sagas, different of Germanic epics in general. And no, it's not because they were influenced by Christianity as such. It's the world that had already produced that, Christianity being also a consequence of. As we explained before about Arians, even the difference within Christendom doesn't speak favorably in favor of the early Germans, right? And actually does speak in favor of those that didn't engage into that, such as the Franks that converted to Catholicism straight away and were by far the most powerful since the beginning. The homogenization is also a thing, right? The Roman Empire, again, did not emerge, did not conquer the world, in fact, by thinking that there was some rigid administrative uniformity in things. The Romans were very squared, very disciplined, very aware of the incarnation of divine rule probably in this world. But in this, they thought of that in primitive, conquering, brutal, bloody terms. They were stern but fair, and so they allowed those who fought for them, and so sacrificed for that matter, were able to elevate to their own standards in that sense. Very different from what starts happening in late antiquity, what we call essentially like almost a Byzantine way to things, that is, that are notoriously characterized by heavy bureaucracy, more statal centralization, properly the lock of social status standards. Think about the capitatio iugatio of the age of Diocletian. This is in and of itself, again, already a consequence of that social cultural exhaustion to a degree, right? You start properly at this point, see the state issuing things and trying to uniform and homogenize, exactly because the system does not hold itself on its feet anymore. And actually, the Byzantines create hell of a state that more or less continues up to the 11th century in the original form, albeit very sort of deteriorated along the way. This is a bit true also for the same Islam. Islam adopts that same late antique state form, whereas the Latin Germanic world actually inherits a lot of that, but is able, and this is the most important thing, not to sclerotize it. It actually injects it with more fertile spiritual force. There is in this sense, no state in between. There is a sense of acknowledgement of one's virtue and power, and so the ruler does govern by example, and he ideally doesn't ask to be followed. Naturally, these were humans, and so things happen. But it's different. There is definitely a different spiritual temper. And again, we shouldn't overly categorize even in here. Like there was a sense of chivalry even among, I don't know, even the early Arabs, were the Turco-Mongol and heavily Persified in that sense world. There were all the legacy of the Iranic peoples in the same empire and so on. But still, like if you look at how stratified and ranked all the various elements of society really were, their background, so you realize that the West maintained, still to this very day, the greatest level of autonomous liberty than any other people in the world. No other people in the world ever had anything like this. And so it's, again, incredibly important to stress, because you can have, again, people that we mythologize a bit too much, the warrior. But the warrior is somebody that fights for himself primarily, even if to transfigure the world around him, but he's in this sense an elite element of a broken world where everybody sort of works for sustaining him, which is a bit what also the medieval world is at the end of the day. And also medieval Europe, for that matter, that, however, again, achieved more results that way because it realized the need for more cooperation with these broken elements of the great Catholic past of Rome, as opposed to other peoples that were more spent, less sort of cohesive. And so this can't be just an explanation of some structuralistic or systemic nature. The Senate is meant to have lost effective authority, but never, in this sense, confused like the Senate in Rome and the one in Constantinople. Because indeed, the Senate of Rome remained quite powerful within its own regional dimension based on that level of high quality of its elements, whereas the Constantinian Senate is created out of a class of sort of middle-class bureaucrats that were fundamentally uniform and homogenized on the basis of some standardized schooling, as opposed to the higher culture, erudition, and sort of spiritual cultivation of the great senatorial families of Rome that were so powerful that Constantine had probably to get out of Rome to rule, to begin with, to imitate Rome attentively as well. Juridical distinctions among Roman citizens, Latins, and Peregrini, as you know, were gradually raised through universal grants of citizenship. This was also the consequence of just a fait accompli. I mean, after all, the Romans had conquered the world. They had all these various peoples. They had settled down. They had mingled with them. So it's kind of obvious the differences are leveled. That's something that's apparently beyond the control of anyone in many ways. Every person is different. Every person is sort of racially better or worse than another. You can't even maintaining this idealistic and absolutistic standards. The question is, what are your personal standards? Right? Because if we go simply by that, like if you don't believe in transcendence, if you don't believe that you can grow out something else in a metaphysical way, you shouldn't at that point even copulate, because in any case, whoever is either racially inferior or superior to you, and so whatever you do, you commit a sin or a crime until you are actually worth of it, because it's actually from a crime that divinity also is born to some extent, but only in fact if it manages to beat that same sin. And that is exclusively based on transcendence, not on zoological determinism. Now, the rule rested on military dictatorship, more or less at this point, supported by a relatively inert bureaucratic apparatus that actually did work pretty well for what it had been conceived for. Holding together an ecumenate that had become a disarticulated cosmopolitan aggregate to an important degree. This is very interesting because indeed it's not much a matter of how different the empire was within itself. It had always been very different indeed. Rome had literally emerged as a city, not even as a people, as a whole. Eventually, yes, it was the Romano-Italics that basically ruled over other regional equivalents, but the point being they had always ruled over other peoples across Europe and the Mediterranean, and what lacked here was a cohesive, unified, higher authority that had previously existed. Otherwise, the Romans could have never had an empire to begin with, or anybody else for that matter. So, as it happened in other circumstances, these empires eventually deflate, right? And so what remains is more like the provincial element, the local differences that had been precious for the empire and that had been quite determinant also in Romanity, right? The moment properly which they had been born, like in the conquest, with the conqueror and the conquered, and that, however, at this point is all but it emerges. But actually, the provincial dimension had always been there. There's never been a Roman state that had homogenized everything. Right. What happens rather is, for example, in the West, the Romano-Italics ethnically altered the landscape of other peoples. They make them speak Romance successfully, and again, what means that we're evidently not impositive in a sort of, either you start speaking Latin or die. That's obviously happened by osmosis. Whereas the East, it was the more sort of subjected element, the more civilly developed, but also the more morally, again, subject to a different degree, does not get Romanized, ethnically speaking. And that's very interesting, for example, because you see that the West maintains a greater courageous homogeneity and power in history, in spite of its ethnic differences, whereas the East kind of doesn't. We made lots of videos explaining this from also within an ecclesiastical perspective. They had started observing this from the early centuries of the empire, namely the fact that the Eastern churches would have at some point collapsed and been taken over by somebody else, which is what literally happened. Hippolytus predicted this almost half of a millennium before it happened. I made an entire video about it. Now, occasional figures of genuine Roman stature appeared in all of this. One can't look at late antiquity and say, well, there weren't such great rulers. There were, right? All the ones we mentioned before. We can add Aurelian, we can add Justinian, like however you want to see the entire picture. Constantine, the same Diocletian, Theodosius, etc. Like they were really great figures. Even some provincially scaled kind of rulers, such as, different usurpers, but even the same Majoranus, still by the 60s of the 5th century, everybody said, oh my god, the West had to fall, whatever, was about basically reconquer the entire Iberia and to redeport the Visigoths somewhere else. Hadn't the Vandals stood in between at that point. So actually these figures are very heroic and very interesting. We haven't made too many videos about them, but I think it's about time to start discussing them. I will be preparing some video in that regard. Now, the imperial centuries thus exhibit a glaring internal contradiction. On one side, an increasingly elaborate theology, metaphysics, and liturgy of sovereignty taking shape, with every Caesar acclaimed in terms of the Adventus Augusti, which has the same etymology of Sebastos, by the way. His arrival, it's from augere, that means to elevate oneself in a metaphysical sense, in the traditional sacred royal sense. It's the same one of the pontifex. He properly bridges the God and man in this occult dimension where he's constantly struggling, eternally rising as the king of the living, hence also the solar metaphor with the Sol Invictus, etc. In fact, the emperor's arrival was heralded by prodigies in the natural order and accompanied by portents at his departure. In medieval times, you see this highly repeated and, in this sense, as a continuous mechanism that lived well through the imperial Catholic Christian tradition. Look at Frederick II, right? The fact he was born on December 26th was meant to be a second Christ. And when he died, there were all kind of visions everywhere. We made lots of videos also on the slumbering monarchs in German folklore. It's something that, again, is so deeply part of Western identity. It was present also in other cultures, don't get me wrong. Pretty much everywhere in the world. And that's why we actually talk about a universal tradition, right? And nobody can deny that this didn't continue through Christianity. I mean, the entire lexicon of Christian theology, also probably in a metaphorical and metaphysical sense, is descriptive of this dynamic. Like every single piece of Christian art is specifically expressing one point in divine transfiguration. All right, if you enter any church of our beautiful Europe, at every step, if you look at the sort of brilliant paintings, if you look at all the work of art of Christian civilization, the entire point is the same one. You can find also, in fact, in a neoclassical key within a same Christian world at the time, but even before Christianity in the West. The emperor was hailed as restorer of eternal light. In different ways, you find plenty of symbolism like this, even in the iconography of Louis XIV. But again, this was really pretty much out there until like the post-traditional world, so just like a couple of hundred years ago, even sort of less or sometimes more. That was the Pontifex Maximus as well, recipient of universal dominion, symbolized by the solar corona radiata and the celestial scepter. Yet, beneath this elevated ceremonial axis at the time, there unfolded an ever more demonic spectacle of assassination, cruelty, betrayal, and inhuman passion that intensified as the empire descended toward its final convulsions. That's also the reason why the Roman Empire didn't even have a proper succession mechanism formally codified, because the deep belief was that the emperor would rise just out of merit. There was no reason to think that somebody would be able to rule if it wasn't virtuous enough. But naturally, somebody can be less virtuous, that the more virtuous past rulers as well. And Augustus and Caesar had obviously set the standard in that regard. Christianity entered this widening breach as a pretty peculiar bunch. Some would look at this and say this is a Dionysian religion of some sort. I mean, it's so passionate in some ways, it's so emotional, and at least it describes humanity in a way that it definitely vibes among those that really feel those passions, that however are perturbed by, right? So even though there are weak people that surely approach religion as a form of, probably God as a even a form of religion, because religion is not the accurate traditional term to describe the relation between God and man, as in fact some sort of shield of trying something that you can't simply put yourself under after sort of rough time passes without doing much about yourself, and then you will simply grow weak and die. Or, as Christianity it bases its entire message on, you can take your own cross, you can self-sacrifice and achieve the unthinkable. And this is exactly what also the broader sort of past sustained regarding the necessity of self-sacrifice in order to acquire higher divine wisdom, right? So again, Christianity really not alien at all from the previous Catholic traditional understanding of divine transcendence and world domination. It's how you achieve that here is surfacing, right? And Christians are very provocative in this regard, because they say, look, that even if you're powerful in an exterior sense, that it's not by earthly standard that you can simply judge your power. At least you should, because the imperium is the Holy Ghost and providence is there, but is this anything compared to God? And why are you, in that sense, so weak, right? And why is the empire declining? And this is a question that, again, was asked in many other parts of the world, in China, in India, etc. And the question is, yeah, it's your fault, and so you should essentially re-understand what it means to properly self-sacrifice and how and why. To realize that the only cause of your mortality is the fear of death, right? And so this is definitely very far from the notion that Christianity would primarily address just fractured human types no longer capable of a sapiential ascent, or at least it is correct by the degree it was trying to fix it, right? And so, as we said before, it was a consequence of the fact that humanity had turned apparently irremediably into this, and Christ poses himself as the remedy for it. The same concept of fate, for example, is terminologically the part of the same Catholic tradition. The fides was properly this bond that established properly between God and man, that would reflect in the sense also the relation between peoples and the same people, as a matter of fact. So the notion that fate would be some sort of tumultuous impulse of a disturbed soul toward the supernatural is correct to the extent that that human type is faulty and frail. And this thing, I think, applies really to lots of people, right? When is in the last time, in 2,000 years, you've seen somebody rising from the dead, right? That's a question you should pose yourself. And also, why did this last for 2,000 years? Like, I mean, the empire ended. People could simply at some point revert to previous beliefs. Why did that happen? Right? Where was this quality, this inner quality of certain cultures or individuals based on ethnicity? Like, you're a bit late for that. You're millennia late to prove that would be the edge of it. And we could digress on modernity. So, because I don't think modernity exists, really, and I think that there are very good things about our own times that are in fact traditional and that don't get enough credit for, and to get sort of mixed and trashed or in ways that are in fact completely oblivious, even of basic theological realization regarding what we mean by tradition, and including within Christianity, obviously enough, that is perceived in the sense as anti-traditional, because when there wasn't Christianity, things were better, right? And people don't seem to understand exactly what they mean by better, or what would, in this sense, be required of them in order to make it better, right? So there is no doubt that Christianity itself intended fate as a disciplined path of inner realization, right? And who can't do that is the guy who is going to have problems with faith, not those who continuously train themselves in this quite difficult exercise. Then there is Christianity's eschatological announcements of an imminent kingdom, together with vivid portrayals of eternal salvation or damnation, exacerbating the existential crisis of such types that get perturbed, instead crystallized around the figure of the crucified Redeemer, of a mode of liberation conducted on the plane of different doings, as we've seen here. The idea that there would be affectivity, rudimentary mysticism, rather than initiatic discipline is partially true if we look especially at today's world and today's understanding of Christianity. That's essentially how it morphed. But Christianity is, like, it's not even was, an initiatic discipline. Right? It's literally like all the sacraments are about that, like all the catechesis is about that. It can't be really, if you can't think that, I don't know, in also in previous times, everybody had some sort of more elite, kind of aristocratic, warlike kind of achievement eventually, and they did the Roman Empire anyway, and also Christ took over the world after all. So the eschatological dimension is quite fascinating. People get often too literalistic about the Bible and what, in that sense, Christ is meant to express. Like this is obviously nobody can fully find the answer, because Christianity, as just like in any liminal sense, any Catholic tradition shows us the limit, right? And so eschatology is meant to, just like, I don't know, think about the Age of the Wolf, the Twilight of the Gods, the Ragnarok, etc. That's an eschatological announcement, right? The Indo-European mentality is inherently linear, right? There's a cyclicity in all of this, but there is also an activity that is meant properly to restore divinity in the world. Think about Midgard. That's the point of this freedom. It's properly a dominion that has to be conquered in that regard. And so Christian eschatology is quite fascinating because it essentially looks at a time beyond time itself, right? The end time is not meant to be to matter as a chronological illusion, like time, the one that time really is, also according to Catholic tradition in general. It is an interior matter, right? It has to do with what you are in the here and now, but intended in a hyper real sense, going to do in order to relate yourself with God before it's likely going to be too late, right? There is something of you that can transcend in the effort, but there is this inherent condition of inferiority after the fall that is caused by your own sins. And so you have to strive for achieve that ultimate end. And so what Christian eschatology suggests is that, and there are beautiful expressions, you will hear of wars and of sort of rumors of wars, like, but don't worry because it won't be yet the end. I mean, this phrase alone confers such a purely souled confidence in the world. The same apocalypse. Many people think that the apocalypse, it's just a scary story of some sort in the Holy Scripture. It's absolutely not true. The purpose of the apocalypse is notoriously also not just in a theological, obviously it's also theological, but in a literary sense, merely like it's based to actually make people relieved that there are going to be specific signs. That actually is the maybe more superstitious dimension of it, but again, it's to be understood in a deeper archetypal, symbolical, metaphorical sense that actually push the soul to investigate the world they live in order to be able to break free through its own transcendence and their own self-actualization. This is what it is all about. I mean, if you think about the times in which we live that are rigged by war and a lack of confidence in the future, the idea that there is a spark in the heart of man that can say, I don't care, because whatever happens to me, I know that there is a standard that never dissolves, right? There is a being that never corrupts. There is something that is beyond this, right? That my soul yearns for and that can achieve through faith and this lack of fear. This is deeply embedded in eschatology in general. The Christian one is no exception, right? The fact also that the divine descended into the human, how is this limiting? I mean, if truly by also all available pre-Christian tradition, man is a product of the fall from divinity and exists merely because there is a divinity left in him, why wouldn't God descend definitely to the human and show how even the least of conditions in which Christ put himself in can be and must be actually as the abyss. This is all, by the way, we've seen it in many videos about Indo-European theology, that it's the abyss, is the darkest of the abyss, that is the true launching pad for heaven. What do you think that Christianity is about when it talks about poverty? We've seen it also recently with Meister Eckhart. Is material poverty? No, it's what derives from a general lack of want, which if you plunge yourself into will make you truly see what's the most important thing out there, right? We all know that's an initiatic tradition itself. Like you have to sacrifice in order to elevate yourself, because if you can't, you will die in the process, and if you can, you will have want. So there is no fear. It's a bit like Krishna talking to Arjuna. What do you fear? Why do you fear to fight? Right? It's so self-evident, and so there is the law, obviously enough, in Christian, but also in the older biblical tradition. It's a mystery tradition, right? We don't even need to talk about, I don't know, the Ark of Alliance or the Eucharist, for that matter. Here, Christianity offers a clear accessibility for a totalizing world rule. Every person can access that, which doesn't mean that every person is welcome or every person is tolerated. It means that every person can, right? That in a world that was based on rigid divisions in terms of increasingly largely different states, particularly even also in the East, etc., the notion that the entire world could be transcended, this entire order could be transcended if you really want. I mean, if this is not inspiring in and of itself, what is it? Right? Christianity does not say, well, we like poor people because we actually want to be poor. You never find any of this in the Gospels. This is entirely a matter of pushing yourself to an extreme that can make you lord over your entire limits. And that's what the entire history of the cross is about. And it's obvious that in late antiquity, in all this moral malaise and in this political decadence and everything, it's obvious that the Christian premise would be conceived as, a viable path for everyone that would want to say, okay, so I just believe in Christ, I'm saved. That's not even what the Holy Scriptures say, right? There isn't such a grant of redemption through a pandemic sense of grace that simply falls on you. Right, in Europe we fought each other for centuries down the line because of this, right? And Catholicism is not there for a random chance in the first millennium and a half, unchallenged in a truly traditional sense within Christianity. Many people think that there is plenty of superstitious, deterministic sort of self-justificatory attitude of scaramancy and all this kind of things in many parts of any culture and society, etc. And Christianity is no exception to this. But the deeper meaning is completely different, even just by basic theological foundation, by basic scriptural evidence. You don't really need to scratch much beyond the surface. It's more like people becoming dumber, not understanding what that actually means. Also because, bear in mind, like if you have an idea of how people lived 2,000 years ago, you know pretty darn well that they had a completely different neurocognitive approach to reality, to the world, right? They were much more exposed to death. They were much more exposed to violence. They lived in a much more, in the sense, dangerously unpredictable world. They had much want for anything in a material sense. So you can't think, you read the gospel today, you feel superior to anyone who wrote it down at the time, nor that you can simply understand immediately what that was meant for, right? Even though obviously the message is meant to be universal and timeless, but it's you who has detached from that time, and you can't see where it comes from anymore. It's not like this time has to make a favor to you to make you feel less challenged and more spoiled about that, right? So world, flesh, death, these are all real issues in all of us, right? We all think about this, we all feel this, we all live this, and it is the metaphysical and physical condition in which we find ourselves in, And I don't need today to obviously repeat what this is all about, traditionally speaking, how we are in this condition, and how much of a question mark the entire tradition still is, right? Because that's exactly the point. Like, Christianity is not meant to simply comfort you, but to inspire you. It's meant to make you think, what is your deeper relation with this world? What are your standards that you should abide by? What is the limit that you would be able to reach if you were to truly fight for the truth, right? How seriously would you take it? Again, you may live well in a Christian country everywhere in the world with splendid churches everywhere in the world, but if you come to Europe and you see the stratified history of Christianity for millennia, and our cathedrals, our basilicas, our churches, every kind of, again, vestige of our spiritual tradition and past, how can't you see that this is celebrating a power that no earthly one can achieve? Because there is only a true being that is superior to everything. And that the purpose of these places is to give you a gateway to it, and to resist to any authority that you're not in charge of yourself, right? And if they can't achieve power over you, it can be because they're bad at it. Don't get me wrong. But there is a difference in this sense between opposing authority because you're a communist that wants everything destroyed and die in the process, or you refuse authority because you see the sin in it and you want this authority to be sublime and divine and kind. This is the meaning of our cathedrals, right? And, we would easily get killed before anyone can impose themselves on us. That's the entire point of it all. If you're not willing to do that, you would totally deserve to be subjugated. What happened in late antiquity is definitely that, if this Christianity had been so terribly Bolshevik in kind, like, why did it actually prevail as a major power? It's a bit difficult to explain, right? So you may want to change your mind about its nature. There's also this notion that, as we explained at the beginning in other videos, that the entire spiritual complex of Christianity would remain profoundly foreign to the Roman and more broadly also in the European ethos. This, again, is just a matter of degree and historical context. What do we mean by that? It's obvious that Christianity was not around by the time of the Mycenaeans. You had, admittedly, the Old Testament, so that is also interesting because, the Jews were there to withstand the sea peoples themselves. So again, you can't merely... other cultures were ruling the world, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and more. So Indo-Europeans may have been free out there, but they also conquered a world that was more advanced than theirs in Europe at a point, and at the same time a more decadent one in victorial spirituality, so to say. It would be very interesting to see, in fact, how also the civilization, so-called civilization of the matter, was actually, in fact, ruled by elements that were less feminine, less Demetrian, less chthonic, and so on. But there is no doubt that, in fact, the same Levantine culture, if you look at the Sumerians, if you look at this, there is actually a pretty strongly potent Indo-European trace there, right? They were not meek peoples at some point in history at all. So even there, you have to say, who were, in the sense, the Indo-Europeans? Who were these other peoples? Who were they before, right? Naturally, some traditionalists would say that also different people sort of fell at different times in history. And so they would have been, in terms of divine matrix, actually not married into one another. If anything, they actually mixed later. And so that would be the point of saying they were of different spiritual stock. And so when you look at these, if you look at the Minoan art, this red-skinned Pelasgians of Mediterranean, eventually sort of meeting with the Indo-European world, recorded ware culture, the Yamnais, etc. Like the question is, yeah, they would have been different by which degree? This is interesting because actually the historical traditionalism places the arrival of the Hyperborean race from in fact the west, the north initially, and then the west. And we'll talk about this in the different ages, from the gold to the silver to the bronze. And this would be true even for, I don't know, the pharaohs, saying the first ones came from the west. What does that actually mean? And instead, obviously, our Kurganic theory today obviously overlaps with much of what we know about Indo-European migrations, ethnogenetics, etc. But what happened thousands and thousands of years ago is not entirely clear. I can tell you as a historian that it's not much that we know, because there is the alternative occult knowledge. We have tradition that tells us some things that are very interesting, right? But the problem is that we can't merely prove them by in fact, conventional documentary method. But in this sense, the Europeans would have been born not somewhere simply in the steppe or in the Caucasus, whatever. Like, of course, the broader origin of the Indo-Europeans is meant to be like fundamentally today's northern Russia. They could even be part of an inferior Hyperborean origin, etc. But the sources speak explicitly of a Western derivation. It's all the myth of Atlantis and etc. Again, today I don't want to talk about this, but it's also obvious that by the time of the Roman Empire, the historical races of mankind had already pretty much met one another. We also know, technically, at least if we accept our methods of dating and conventional science, which, again, I personally have been raised into it, so I don't have much to oppose in our ways. We know we're deeply entwined, like the notion that at some point the Americas would have been discovered, right? It's not even about Columbus or the Vikings, who was further. Well, like, we know very well that in a technological sense, continents were very much interconnected since a much longer time than we think. This is pretty pacific, well-established historiographical realization. It's not really a matter of opinion. The question is, again, how does this all tie in, and what is that we are looking at here? Was there truly in the Mediterranean this radical division between different parts of the same, to the point that sort of everything that came from the Levant was fundamentally alien from sort of a broader European culture? It's a bit difficult to claim. The differences existed, but there are also the famous battle axe of the Jutland of the earliest, like 4000 BC. Actually, it was connected with Neolithic models from Mesopotamia. So again, it's not really clear, especially by the standards that these higher beings would have had in the previous millennia, according to tradition. How would these differences that we eventually see by the time of late antiquity would have actually been relevant in the broader discourse? That's all I'm sort of pointing out, for obviously smoothen the notion that, again, Christianity came out of nothing and nowhere, was completely fake or copying others or with a ill intent, etc. It's good luck sort of proving any of this in academia with religious historical evidence or anything. But it's obvious that in the 20th century, the stories were very much told in a way that emphasized this, sharpened this divide. Sometimes you can easily find among the main critics as unavoidably hostile, in particular towards Christianity, because there is no doubt that those archetypal differences existed. They are actually very well documented. But how much this applied to Christianity, also in relation to Judaism, it's a much more contentious knowledge. And also, again, why did it take over the world? Right? That seems to me that, like, in the absence of even of any kind of spirituality, why would today, like, isn't it obvious that the same Christianity was a vestige of Catholicism, in the sense of pre-Catholic, pre-Christian tradition, and that we're just like probably the least worth condition of humanity that the world has ever seen. Like, I think that there is a connection there. And 2,000 years of Christian history, of crusades, of struggle against the infidels, of true Catholicism, of Christian, in this sense, European unity. Well, I think that they do have some meaning. Absolutely, there are some racial ones as well that are very important from a moral point of view. They surely inform them in a way. It's absolutely the case that Western Christendom was a much more historically continuous Catholic reality with Rome, because also in fact, the medieval Christianity was very much like a product more of a Western sensitivity as opposed to the original Levantine one. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever about this. But again, why does the mold work? And why especially did it last so long? Everybody's, oh my God, the Roman Empire lasted so long. Wow. Actually, yes. Most people actually ask, why did the Roman Empire fall instead of concentrating on how long it lasted? But, why does barely anyone wonder how did the papacy last so long? And they all seem unimpressed. I don't know that, general global anti-papistic Protestantly molded brainwashing is part of the destruction of any imperial Catholic traditional standard. But even the Chinese come to study the Vatican to explain, to try to see, and they come from China. That is also not quite a recent civilization, because you need to notice, to try to understand how can something last that long. Which is a much more interesting question than what probably pseudo Professor Young or whatever would pose. But hey, lesser people are always going to be lesser people. And this is the point. These are the lesser people you have to track. Obsession with anything, including with Christianity, is not really a great deal of a problem. Myself, I don't preach Christian principles all the time, just explaining you historical analysis and criticism as opposed to some. I leave you believe whatever you want for that matter. And so the idea that Christianity would enthrone pathos over ethos doesn't seem very coherent, because the Passion of the Christ is not very different from the same Dionysian shamanic trances that were stimulated warriors from the lower tiers of the wolf pack of the sacred brotherhood of warriors, right? In the same way, like torture to death that normally happened in those very war bands. So we're talking about the very basic initiatic starting pack, and the one that brought to entire self-sacrifice in a single blow. Like Christianity does not even give us that's how just you have to start. No, Christ comes back to God as God immediately, right? Mithras' symbol, by the way, is that Mithras was a stone. So nothing, right? It's just Christ was a person. The stone there was to symbolize the nothingness total, the most complete misery. And Mithras, as you know, becomes the sun himself. Beaten becomes the sun at the same time. Beating and sort of sublimating humanity in the sense of it is the meaning of it whole. That's also why Christ equates himself to the snake, to the venom, the poisonous. Like the thing, if you don't mithridize yourself, you cannot grow stronger and survive, right? And so, what is equivocal about this soteriology, really? Like over, the severe style of patrician jurists, military leaders, and other pre-Christian sages, like what was so allegedly squalid or inferior or bad about Christianity? There is in fact a deep mistake in terms of transcendence when people say that in Christianity the divine no longer symbolizes the impassible essence establishing the distance from the merely human, given that actually one of the greatest psychological problems regarding late antiquity is the hypostatization, right? between God and man, because it was felt like the gap was practically impossible to fill. And so in an eschatological sense, Christ provided with the ultimate salvation. It is true and eternal, but people keep dying and suffering in the meanwhile. Why? Christomimesis is quite explicit as a prescription in Christianity. You should behave like Christ. In other words, you should attempt to be God. So, if anything, it's the other way around. If you think there should be a difference between God and the last of the last, you're actually already using a defeatistic mentality. Like nobody can actually bring God down there, or God even is less powerful than you think. So in any case, it's an anti-traditional belief. It was, this is often underappreciated, that we think that all of a sudden like Christianity emerged from nowhere, but it was from centuries there, and a whole lot of people from everywhere were Christian. Even patricians actually were early Christianized in some cases. It wasn't such a thing that happened later. After all, how do you stop, in this sense, beliefs? Rome was already habituated to sort of aggregate all these various cults in her feudal hierarchy. Remember that even though there were some cults that were properly understood as evil and indecent, Christianity was never banned in that absolute sense. I don't know, like the Bacchic phrases and so on. It was full of Christians everywhere. In the military, a lot of them, and they felt that there was no difference. Nobody complains that this guy's a Christian, can't fight. Not even in Christian geography there is any of that. The idea I can't spill blood per se. Like there were instances of saying I will defeat the enemies still by not unsheathing my sword, but we've seen it for example, in Saint Martin of Tours geography. But none of let's say the entire problem, especially in the age of persecutions, as far as what you had, because at that time Christianity was already legalized, right? We're at the time of Julian. It's not the religion or the official religion of the empire, but it's still it's already legalized, and Julian naturally tried to sort of prevent that. But the geography, as we've seen in and of itself, is also relatively mediated through also in that case that meek kind of ecclesiastical perception. There's no doubt that priesthood was in many ways, in a more deteriorated way, sheltered compared to the earlier priesthood. Again, humanity collapses. There's no doubt that you can absolutely understand a bit that sick-haunted kind of Christian geography in some cases. In other cases, probably that the geography was written by people who are inclined more or less, but there are geographies that literally exalt blood sacrifice, right? That were written for Clovis and celebrating his dynasty. So I wouldn't go as far as that, but from Romans, right? Not from Germans, authoritatively speaking. But the point was the sacrifice to the divine emperor, to the divinity of the emperor, saying, no, that guy was not divine. I can't. And these were otherwise all soldiers that already practiced. And they were at that point cornered to perform that right. And that's also very interesting. As we were saying before, what earthly standards do you choose? Right? There is a freedom of conscience as well that is a pretty powerful spiritual issue. Like if the world pressures you against a decision, like for the truth, how are you willing to go? Naturally, you must be really convinced, right? You must be really sure that what the truth is. But again, faith is that. After all, we can't see as much as we would like to. Our entire world is an illusion. We created it because of our sin, etc. So again, the willingness, if anything, to seek that breakthrough, we were saying before, it's all one with the Catholic message, right? You have to lead yourself. You have to be free. Like, so how are you going about? And there is an argument to be made, of course, regarding the pros and cons of this, meaning that the Romans were, in this sense, for example, fairly tolerant in terms of beliefs compared to other peoples. Well, at least they had systematized that approach. So there were few things that as universal rules themselves asked, right? But in this sense, freedom of conscience was infringed upon. And that's also another thing that you have to realize. Again, it's more about the power of convincing through the display of divine power than anything at that point. That's also why the Christians they appreciate that they see Rome, Romanity, the Augustan era, was same one in which Christ was born, as a particularly providential one. The myth that Christians fought against the empire is incredibly widespread, and I don't think people have really read much early Christian literature to know that the Christians were not just Romans, in that sense, largely, many of them at that point, but they explicitly backed the Roman Empire, said, we're more than happy nobody called for the destruction of the empire, if not in a conceptual sense, by the evil moral predisposition of an anti-Christian regime, right? Not because the state, or at least Rome as such, was to be destroyed or had to be fundamentally eradicated as a civilization. They didn't ask that. Even if it hadn't been a Christian fundamentalist, it surely existed with iconoclastic pulsions and communistic leanings. There was plenty of them in some places, and that's also the churches that failed at the end of the day, where most heresy was harbored in the East. This is again all well documented. If you believe that I'm just extremizing things, go check that video about Hippolytus's prophecy about the fall of the Eastern churches, and they failed anyway. And again, we don't have evidence of sabotage of Romanity at that point. You find, we mentioned Julian, some say that a Christian killed him, as he was considered a tyrant from a Christian perspective, but we don't even know whether he was actually killed by a Christian in that sense. And bear in mind that literature is very already sort of, not uncritical, but say very particularly guided. We've seen it from the other side as well, in another way as well, with the same geography of Saint Martin of Tours. And so there could be a victorious Christian commander. This is mostly there was a diffidence among Christians up until the end of the 4th century. It's Saint Ambrose of Milan and Theodosius the Great that fundamentally seal the true Christianity of the Roman army. The idea that church and state were allies, and that even though always separated, because I will never stop repeating this, the church exists as it is separated from the state. Like, church and state separation is not something that happens a couple of 100 years ago. That simply meant the state became atheist, all right, and that it wanted to detach itself or more from the church in a broader cultural, moral, spiritual sense. And look at where it went. Thus, you also have a lot of military saints, as you well know, that, yes, are mostly martyrs, regardless of sort of the veracity of their geography from a historical standpoint in any case, but they become vehemently, in Christian times, warriors. Not that had simply had been killed because they didn't want to sacrifice, but because they were actual soldier. And it's actually not much a transformation or flipping of the coin. It's literally who they were at the time, right? And so it's actually very realistic, and it's incredibly good that Christianity celebrates the value of the military and the one of victorious commanders, because there is no greater victory than achieving a place in heaven. As we've seen, there's a principle that was definitely owned by crusaders, and pretty much anybody who fought for the cross throughout all history. It's not like crusades began anything from that theological point of view. No, it had already all existed. The crusades are big as a change just by the degree a reformed papacy could send such divisions, so to say, to reconquer the Holy Land. But the reconquest of Christian lands historically had always been an imperial prerogative. It had been already been backed by the church. Everybody was blessed for that. The Crusades are not born in 1095, all right? It's complete nonsense. It's just a form of modern categorization of the same, of the kind, properly. And so you have also, it's very difficult to make a video like this, because the question is, every single step you should explain how double-threaded any Catholic meaning is, whether we're talking Christianity or pre-Christianity. Think about the idea that no one comes to the Father except through me, right? Isn't this like what Mithras said? I mean, what's the entire point of Mithraism? If not like, this hero made it, you have to do what he did. What is Christianity? I mean, the modes are different, all right? The vibes are different, but the theological principle is literally the same, identical one, right? And so it is true that, for example, the exclusive mediation feels like, okay, but it sounds messianic, it sounds too deterministically eschatological, but why does it sound like that? It's because people decided to entrust themselves to that, right? The same Christian message is not that, right? There had been other Pelagian, Dionysian motives of, for example, sacrifice and resurrected gods overshadowed by the great martyrs. Christianity is evidently not that, as the virile principle rules over the feminine one. And Christ is not sacrificed and resurrected. There are literal, again, mythologies in which the hero is cut to pieces, probably by female goddesses, and so there is this. It's still the same story. He goes to hell, but then he resurrects, etc. This sometimes also the same. The Godfather. This is true, for example, in the Canaanite tradition. So as we were talking about Carthage, for example, it was the case. Christ is in charge. There is not an overarching mother, right? Mary is the symbol of, the sensitivity of womanhood towards the world that a man is called to defend and protect, and to give hope and security, right? And I would say the Gospels are beautiful and poetic in that regard. But Christ self-sacrifices and wins death, right? There are some Christians today that inexplicably think that fundamentally Christ was simply vindicated by God. That's an incredibly incompetent understanding of how the Holy Ghost proceeds here from where to whom. First of all, Christ achieves divinity because he knows in the sacrifice that what he has to accomplish, right? And he follows a path of growth in that regard, and he achieves that, right? He's not a random dude that at some point said, okay, well, if I die, well, I bet on this and maybe I will be saved by God and become God. No, all right? And even this, in any case, is not the pattern of being cut to pieces by some other force that he had not foreseen. He literally says, I will be taken, I will be crucified. And he knew it all. Why? That's providence, obviously enough, in an imminent theological sense. So again, the motive of the virgin birth as well. The Immaculate Conception is part of the highest form of metaphysical redemption of, in fact, the corrupted feminine element by divine virility. In tradition, the idea of being father, husband, and son of your mother is a Trinitarian principle that fixes the metric element, and renders, in fact, Mary like a saint herself, and especially a virgin, through an Immaculate Conception. And the Immaculate Conception, again, is not a Christian invention. It existed also in other religions, and you can check out the only video I think I made in the title, Immaculate Conception. It's one about Hermetic tradition, actually explains that, right? And so there's no doubt that the feminine element is quite present here, but it's unavoidably present and potent as in any Indo-European myth, because the greatest accomplishment was to tame and possess that woman, right? It's not like the pre-Indo-Europeans were merely, we only have this guy, God, just paternal ones, males. No, they understood that in order to achieve that heavenly power, they had to tame and possess the woman, right? It's pretty pacifically notorious that this is the entire theological foundation of also Indo-European metaphysics. And again, we have a series just to remind you of that. And how important are female powers in the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean doesn't matter. If those guys did not develop an equally strong male patriarchal authority next to, they had some of it, by the way, so it's not like it was even there with completely deprived. But say there had been a switch towards the preeminence of the woman, that's a problem. Well, this does not mean that Christianity is that, because Christianity literally is not that. Where does a woman take over? I mean, seriously. It's not like the woman is not important in the Bibles, in the Jewish element, etc. So there is no doubt. It may be redrawn in that sense. The entire history of the Gospels is pretty, again, it's human in nature. It talks about simple people in an earthly sense. It talks about emotion, pathos, etc. But for what? For actually delivering people from it. Or saying, don't worry about it. Right? Woman, why are you crying? That's what a man says after he's been, crucified and resurrected, having resurrected himself from the dead. All right, that's what truly any man wants to stand in front of a woman in a moment of difficulty, and being that point of reference. So again, this femininity of Christianity is very difficult for me to understand. Obviously, again, as we said before, the ecclesiastical world separated from warriorhood, in this sense, the secular in a broader sense, surely is more emasculated. That is true, right? But otherwise, there isn't in the gospel a reference to, okay, you shouldn't be a man, or you should do things that are fundamentally effeminated per se. There is a level of humility that shows, again, how much you must be willing to sacrifice, but there isn't a moment in which, I don't know, like the guy had to be a transvestite or had to be caressing other men or doing something. Like, it's more like, if you read the Gospels, it's more like Christ does stuff and people like, oh my God, look at this guy, who is he? And that's it, right? And now the church adopted the maternal symbol for her as central. There's no doubt about this. I mean, even Rome was a female deity. By the way, this doesn't mean that God, in the sense of Jupiter, did not lord over her, or that there wasn't an emperor that was the epitome of manhood on earth. So again, what's wrong about that? Was the church promoting feminism? If it did, let somebody make it known to the authorities, because we may have found like a big reveal after 2,000 years of studying Christianity as a civilization. So it's very frequent to find detractors of Christian spirituality by claiming that the highest form of its religiosity would be essentially the one of the imploring soul. It's difficult to unsee how this became the case for humanity at that point in history because of the exhaustion of the same. But do leaders, and so those dignified souls that command and achieve, etc., are actually simply implorers of some sort? It's difficult to stress. I mean, imploring is not even just a matter of, who does not implore in life at some point? Right? In front of the greatest loss, right? And it's difficult, humanly speaking, to say, okay, well, I will never implore, or at least when things happen, I'm thinking about not imploring per se, right? It should be the case not to do so, because you should solve your problems by yourself. But in this sense, if you feel to be too weak, and in spite of your efforts, you don't make it, imploring may be useless, but it can't necessarily be bad in any case. And so the acute consciousness of one's sinfulness and worthiness and impotence before the crucified, I don't think is even this great deal of a problem. And who would be able to do what Christ did? Like the only reason why you would kneel in front of Christ is the achievement of the achievements. And one that in fact would override the saying greatest empire in the history of mankind. So it's a bit of a perspectival distortion to presume that you shouldn't be able to see it, and that would be some kind of negative thing, right? Kneeling in the sense of form of respect, right? The idea is that you don't kneel in front of anyone but God, right? And in terms of moral divide, it makes a lot of sense. It's not like you're kneeling in front of somebody else. That's what the Christians refuse to do. If anything, if you kneel, it's because you recognize that power, which is also something that, I don't know, happened among other figures historically. Think about sacred royalty. The proskynesis was a thing also among the Achaemenids, among Alexander. Like, so the Romans adopted. And this also comes along the time of Christianity. The archaic Romans would have disliked it, not for slaves, that's absolutely the case. But when a divide occurs, like the one of late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, and society starts being ruled by people you owe to, like, your defense, your protection, and they are warriors and they strive and they fight. Well, there's a shift, a balance, there is no doubt. This is a problem that it happened. But in this sense, Christianity is just mirroring normal metaphysical relations at that point. People who don't recognize authority, I was just thinking about this, and anarchy is a kind of mental pathology on its own. Christianity does not ask not to see earthly power. It just makes you aware of the fact that comes from a much higher source, that the earthly medium, even the emperor, does not fully incarnate until the world is transcended, transfigured from them. In this sense, Christianity appears like, I show you how to do it, right? It doesn't take away the glory from man to achieve divinity. Which can't really explain why the world was not transfigured, if not in eternity, as Christians say, by Christ's sacrifice. Excuse me, I drink a little. So, does Christianity reject form of virile spirituality? Why? Do you have the balls of killing yourself just to pursue the truth and a providential vision? Well, are you able, let's put it in these terms better, to detach yourself from the world, from all of your possessions, from your humanity, from your existence, to join a higher concept in the name of the same? Is that such a terrible thing? Was it not what, well, I don't know, the heroes of Western civilization were doing by doing what they did? It's the simplicity of it that is perplexing. Is the Christ's sacrifice highlights the convoluted way that men use not to fully abandon their mortal coil, and so that the product of the world, polities, wars, suffering, is in many ways, yes, showing the big potential underneath, but it never concretizes into a full transfiguration, even just a full empire, right? Which is the only purpose to pursue. And so the notion, even less, that the legitimacy of any active transcendence of the human condition would be denied by Christianity is sort of bewildering to hear, to say the least. Again, the same Christian egalitarianism, universal fraternity, indiscriminate love, communal belonging. Isn't it, in a way or another, what sort of even the socialist element of national socialism in the today's rehabilitations of same term socialism is all about, right? Why shouldn't there be a universal fraternity in terms of, I give you the chance, I will give you that chance. It's not like you have the capacity to tolerate everything at all, right? That's not like you should be walked over, right? Turning the other cheek is showing how irrelevant your enemy is if you have that power. Christ himself had something to say against the desecration of the temple with the merchants in it, for example. So I have to explain there also the Jewish conspiracy theory of money and all that stuff. If detractors are so obsessed with such things, indiscriminate love in which sense? Megalosykia? Yes, there are different ways of terming this. Megalosykia is not love per se, but it in its sublimation turns out to be, if you win the world, you transfigure it for everyone living in it. That's what it actually means. And communal belonging is, the stock, right? And the bigger the power, the larger this becomes, because it's capable of transfiguring all towards a divine realization. So, I don't know, like communitarism among sort of the hardcore Bluetooth board, like, isn't it there as well? So you have to explain this, really. It's more like being angry at, successfully achieving something that you can't. And that's how you see this. Confusion, moral confusion, lack of theological understanding, lack of probably sort of more complex thinking, I would say. And as a consequence, also capacity to enact. And so how this was truly or diametrically opposed to Roman hierarchical principles, right? The call into question is this hierarchy able to rule the empire anymore the way it is? And it's not like Christianity created a hierarchy-less world. By the way, this is the thing that always disconcerts me about people who decide to criticize Christianity, reading the book on antiquity and then sort of closing it as the Middle Ages begin, and the Middle Ages do not exist. Like, Christian society was without hierarchy. The church itself, do you know anything about ecclesiastical history? Where's the lack of hierarchy? Anywhere in Christian society. That's a pretty bold proposition. It's seriously asinine and in macroscopically self-evident fashion. So, again, you may see that in the Middle Ages, those boundaries between probably the higher qualities of leadership, etc., are blurred because people have exhausted that capacity of maintaining a more fully fledged hierarchical capacity. But this actually turns into some people maintain it, and the rest collapses without less organic force, right? And so, whose fault is that exactly? Right? It's people abandoning themselves. It's actually people, again, being brought down by some magical oriental influence of this Semitic cult, alien to their culture. Is it them literally stopping to do anything, right? Or being capable of doing it, which is not even true in the Middle Ages, because obviously people in the Middle Ages were much worthier than anything you are right now, without any debate whatsoever. So the question is, what are we even talking about? Seriously. The idea that true universality exists only as the radiation from a hierarchical summit is the entire point of the fall of divinity. We've seen it also in Neoplatonism, right? In this sense, it presupposes and establishes difference by the degree which you have sinned, right? There isn't in Christianity an undifferentiated collectivity, if not one stemming from the collapse of a hierarchy that wasn't able to rule anymore, is but what happened with the Ancien regime in the end. It's not like it's simply lesser people that we have to blame for it, because they are also the less powerful if there is a hierarchy that can keep them under and transfigure them. So what happened in late antiquity did bring to a greater sort of blur, but it happened as a mix, or as a re-engineering of some aspects of the system, as opposed to a lack of status, of rank, of sort of hierarchy of authority. It actually increased, and it just, people changed in the process at all levels, even though there was also a great deal of continuity in terms of the social status. Like, it's not like now shoemakers became the rulers of the empire per se. Like, that's not how empires are run to begin with. And that's also what surprises me. Again, there is not just a Roman Empire goes on in the Byzantine world, but also a thriving Christian world in the West that becomes incredibly powerful and had never really ceased to be so as well. So the Romanization of Catholicism is a very interesting concept. This indeed stems from the aforementioned spiritual predisposition of the Westerners, especially the Roman part, the Romance part, the Latin part of the empire, right? That truly accept Christianity as a more serious challenge than many Orientals that eventually will open the gates to the Arabs, as a matter of fact. The dualism separating supernatural from natural order, when absolutized rather than subordinated to a higher unifying principle, produced distinctive heresies that were, in this sense, fiercely battled against by Christianity, right? They were the ones who generated the notion of the creature essentially separated from a personal creator. These were the elements that within Christianity could not accept that the church also was going somewhere, and decided to sabotage everything till the last, saying, no, the only way you have to actually achieve heaven is simply to die physically. Not to sacrifice for any purpose, or not to be scared of that per se, whatever. It's like you have to destroy everything, right? And so because you have no way to save yourself, just God will if you die. That's Gnosticism. That's Manichaeism. That's that's what the Cathars do later, what the Bogomils even triggered the Byzantines into a crusade, which was unheard of in their culture. And so even the accentuation by emphasis on original sin is actually in line with the degeneration of the world according to the scanning into eras. Again, it's present in all Indo-European mythology. So why should it not happen at some point? And why shouldn't Christianity be seen as, okay, reflect on how to fix the issue? Because we have gotten here before our world. You would say, but it also happened in parallel. So you could always see, again, so Christianity that spreads and makes the thing done. But again, even if we assume that Christianity was expressing the defeat of the world at that point as a fait accompli for whichever reason, surely the world at the time wasn't perfect in an absolute sense. The Golden Age is a moment, all right, in the Augustan era. But also, why did Christianity withhold tradition historically? And say still today, we see that whoever opposes Christianity is part of a anti-traditional world at large, right? And generally speaking, like even in those cases where people say we want to represent what was before, like it's mostly like in primarily hatred towards Christianity as opposed to any actual adherence to any traditional standard of pre-Christian times. And I've never really met a so-called neo-pagan that wasn't a person who was essentially traumatized by a Christian upbringing, as a matter of fact. But it's easier if you understand that you were raised by lesser people, that we were raised by Christians. That sort of is much more explanatory, as a matter of fact. Now, suprasensible influence assumed the passive form of grace, election, or salvation. Catholicism is by definition opposite to every suprasensible influence assumed as a passive form of grace, election, or salvation. Catholicism is about works. Again, we fought each other for centuries over this, confessionally speaking. Catholicism does not leave any doubt about this. Where does this grace come from? How? Like, works are everything in a sense. You wouldn't even have to imitate Christ if that wasn't the case. Also, that's why, again, I will try to be nice, obviously, always to my Protestant followers. I don't need to be harsh to be understood, but you understand that there's a deep problem into this. And if you study especially Christian heresies from the very first centuries, you will discover that in the later millennia, it's not like anything really changed that much as a root of the disintegration and self-sabotage. That is actually the true enemy of European tradition. And so, also, how could heroic possibility be systematically denied if you have warrior saints? If you attribute a sebastocratic power to emperors, right? Even when they sinned, like, they weren't meant to atone for that because they were the pure ones that had held the greater power given by God. And so, again, the idea of never saying a lie, for example, that was already pretty old, right? And in any case, if now humanity had declassed itself, like, the question is, you have to continue fix that sin. And so you have to fear God because you can easily fall out of grace, if anything. It's not like God is this vengeful, strange guy that, is jealous and wants you just that, there is but you can have some anthropomorphization of that, right? You have, even in the same Bible, some aspects of that are the product of the times and the places. But there is no doubt there's something more totalizing about it all, and that you can't read the Bibles in relatively metaphorical ways. And God is an inexhaustible source of grace and love simply because he, in this sense, does not need to do anything other than being, as it's probably part of a different dimension. And if you succeed in entering that dimension, receiving the Holy Ghost through your works by being consonance in harmony with the being, the grace will be inexhaustible. That's the meaning of God's eternal love. So mortification, if you do something wrong, I think is also a pretty obvious feeling. Prayer is a form of contemplation and of spiritual training, etc. It's part of all there are so many practices also in the European traditions that and beyond that train soldiers in that specific way for holy war. Every sacred text was more or less intended to fulfill that role, also because it was probably a simulation, a replication of the divine cosmic harmony. And that's what prayer is supposed to be. It's not asking for something, is to enter in consonance with realities, to atone for your sins, to confess them, to admit them. Because only at that point you can fix yourself. Again, basic catechistic knowledge. And political dualism, in this sense, is a wrong understanding. Also the separation of church and state. Right? Traditional sovereignty is the superimposition of these two elements. And both empire and church are two metaphysical realities. They are always compenetrating one another. It's men that have to cooperate in order to wield these forces in a specialized fashion that can use a sort of combined arm tactics if mankind itself has fallen out of being able to wield both pieces in one. All right. So when Christ says, "My kingdom is not of this world," and command to return unto Caesar what is of Caesar's, it was not severing the sacerdotium from the regnum, it was just expressing the doctrine of the two natures, namely the fact that Caesar is also receiving grace, is also a sacerdos himself. But what pertains to the world, in this sense, remains and stays to the world corruptible. as an hologram, as a shadow properly of something of itself, right? That is meant to simply degenerate and die. So Christ there is simply saying, remember that there is something that never dies, and this is not of this world. I think it's pretty obvious, and it's doing this in human form, and not just in human form, but also in human nature, to literally tell you, look, you can do it yourself. Again, is this so difficult to understand? And so admittedly, there is this debate that happens as well from a political point of view. Like, is there truly no human that can unite kingship and priesthood? Like, authentic sacerdotal royalty in Christianity does belong exclusively to Christ, but Christ in this sense is also God. So how is this different exactly from, I don't know, Mithras again? Like, how in that sense sacred royalty, sacerdotal prerogative next to the warrior one can't be held by a single person? I mean, still, Byzantine tradition held that pretty explicitly. Also, again, the Western one technically did, while the church was more autonomous and powerful and fulfilled some important functions within the same in a more institutionalized fashion. The imperial universality, ordering and unifying above particular cults, demanded a superior fides directed toward the Augustus incarnating the principle from above. Right? So Christians refused the sacrificial act before the imperial symbol because they denied that the office holders were divine. Right? And this is not a matter of, okay, well, let's establish whether they're divine or not, and let's just pretend and get along, play along even if these people aren't. All right? Nobody denied imperial authority as derived from God. Not even the Romans. Right? That's the reason why they thought that at least at some point there was a level of divinity, especially that was achieved ideally in the afterlife, because also in earthly terms was relatively undemonstrable. But of course, if you had been a great ruler, you could think that you had truly incarnated that level of transcendence. And there is, in fact, as we explained also in the doctrine of afterlife, probably a step further in the world that somehow allows your soul to achieve at a level, at least of heaven, that transcendence, as opposed not to make it into afterlife. So this is what the Christians maintain, for example, with sainthood, which frankly is pretty much the same thing and continues undeterred, like from pre-Christian times, with all the heroes that consolidated the world at the time in so many different ways. There's a radical continuity. What do you think saints are that were invented by Christianity? Oh boy. So when Christians declared this imperial authority incompatible with their creed, they were not saying, we don't think that there is an imperium, that this does not derive from God, and that who wields it is not, in this sense, blessed by God, by his grace. The point is, what's the limit of his power, and are we sure that we should simply do everything he says if this thing does not win us over to begin with? Because God's power really does. And there had been an empire that had conquered literally everything before. So people already knew how it happened. Like if you have, I don't know, a Byzantine empire losing half of its territory to the Muslims, the question, whose fault is that? Are you whining as a man because, the enemies beat you? Or do you take responsibility for having screwed up? Like this is incredibly important. Politically, morally, culturally. And so, even when we read, for example, Christian hagiography and this widespread martyrdom properly understood also by some sources we know, genuine ones by Roman authorities, as incomprehensible and madness, we are looking at either a later inflating of this martyrdom number, especially in later Christian literature, and at Roman authorities that said these are just lesser people. What do they even want? Right? They hadn't understood their own world was falling because of their own fault, not much because of the Christians, actually. And why was this cult spreading? Why was it able to win if it was so weak, right? Why did others didn't prevail, right? Even if it had been, again, just because people were weakening, that in and of itself is what people deserve, right? And also the notion that here we don't even know how to go back to divinity anymore should be more a problem of the people than, I would say, what the Christian example pretty explicitly shows in the cross. After all, what is the general message, the deeper message is if there's no other way, you should, that's what Christ tells you while you're praying in front of the crucifix. It says, look, that my only answer to your prayers, to your demands is take on your own cross and go with it. That's all it is. Right? And you'll see what happens then, because that's the bottom line as well. So I think extremely important and unavoidable to interpret this way. So any dualism was vehemently combated throughout all the history of the church, a church that gloriously triumphed over all these, at some point, very threatening dualistic tendencies that show that Catholicism, in any case, was not a dualistic system at all, and that the hypostasis between sort of this separation between God and man was actually not rigid. And actually, like, Christ is not even simply in between, because Christ has already achieved that and has left the way for mankind to behave accordingly. So again, it's not really different from Mithras or other cults that witness to a specific savior, where another was, as you know, this had already happened with Hellenistic rulers. That's basically even a part of Zoroastrianism. That's also what Buddhism turns into. Why? Because people think just, again, they can abandon themselves to it. Whereas the broader point is imitative. Again, Christomimesis, that's the key. The traditional conception that every legitimate power descends from above, carrying supernatural sanction and religious value, was not undermined at its foundation. On the contrary, Christians became more exigent. That is to say, we want to be sure that our rulers are this, because that's the only way to save the world that has evidently taken a blow in the meanwhile. And we're pretty darn worried about what is going on. So it sounds like, let's roll up our sleeves and fix this. And so in a world of sin, only a civitas diaboli could exist on earth. The civitas they had to be necessarily inspired to in order to essentially fix the issue, to redirect the confused longing toward the beyond, towards the actually right direction. And the motto of Christ was the center of it. Accept that this world is ridden with sin and that you have a possibility to win over it and to win over death for eternal life and the world's salvation. And in fact, like this, if you look at medieval civilization in general, like, it's not a subverted system. It's not the prevalence of, I don't know, a communist model, a feministic model. None of this happens, right? What happened, rather, is that obedience to Caesar became more secularized, this out of just pure experience, not much because they didn't think that Caesar had actual divine power. Actually, if you read, we'll make more videos about this, in particular, many texts of how the Roman Church addressed emperors, and so they recognize their divinity in many instances, right? This gets often bypassed, like saying, well, eventually they kind of clashed against one another. Okay, but it's also because the papacy was acquiring there a Caesarian prerogative, not one of undermining the world as ruling it, right? So actually the sacred character of the obedience to the emperor was always there, and in fact formally was never denied, right? And in any case, as you know, how sacred institutions were up to, I don't know, a few generations ago, you can imagine 2,000 years ago. So whatever happened from previous times, this is just a step in a direction and towards which we are or very much more imbalanced than anything that happened at the time. And Christianity had, in fact, its own course of gradual decline as well, just like all the previous eras had had. And so Christianity obviously affirms the reality of the spiritual and supernatural, right? Just in historical operation, we see that people living in our era exercise a dissociative and accelerative function towards the abyss. Christianity, as people, right, exposed to the spiritual path, would not end up revitalizing the world, right? Romanity was actually revitalized in different times in history, but unfortunately, human power all across the world, this is not true in Christianity, this is true across every religion, has been fading, right? And so when you look at the luminous principle of divinity and power, this has become like a fatiguing idea even in today's times. Probably these videos are very tiring to hear, to listen to, but they also show ourselves, right? It seems like it's not like without Christianity things have grown particularly better overall, right? And so Christianity receives the final threads of the heroic Roman cycle. It sadly witnesses, in certain cases, hastens, again, all the lower principles in the world did, of a closer, of great tradition, of a great tradition, like the Roman one, at that precise moment when vital possibilities had been exhausted by people. So when you look at the race of Rome, so to say, prostrated in spirit and personnel, ancient traditions obscured, ethnic chaos rampant as well, an imperial symbol reduced to a contaminated vestige amid general ruin, you can understand how relevant it is actually the revival of the imperial Catholic tradition in the Middle Ages and how much of a truly Roman character this has in a fully Christian world that was the one that achieved the re-expansion of Western power, actually in the Middle Ages, in modernity, up to this very day. And that's also something that, in fact, I think we could see, it probably there is going to be in the future. Like there's already, at this point, a realization that the abandonment of Christianity was a backstabbing, in a sense, of a previous culture and civilization. And at that point, we will have to realize that even though some people made it so, this also depended on those who didn't act, right? And that had obviously a solid propension towards this tradition throughout various ages, and that the Roman Catholic one, in this sense, is the key for preserving all this legacy without rejecting the good aspects, the positive, the righteous aspects of the same within it. That's the main problem. Not being ungrateful towards our ancestors, but carrying their sins and fixing them and making us stronger as we train in that direction. Difficult to conclude a series like this because the point is to leave not much necessarily a question mark, but some nuance as far as the gravity in particular of the situation and how complicated the accurate or objective framing and outlining of this history and awareness really is, right? There is going to be really a continuity in our Christian history content, but I hope that this was answering some of the questions that I received also in the past months from Q&As, etc., that tended to to show this general confusion in the matter, this genuine confusion, this honest confusion in the matter, a sincere one, because indeed we have not been adequately trained to understand this period, and we are sort of too anxious to jump to conclusions when we haven't even began to actually make things work, right? And I would like instead to revive people's interest and attention towards this passage, and especially in the heritage of 2000 years that cannot be simply discarded or taken as nothing, considering also the great Catholic accomplishment of the same in the wake of Romanity, as with Rome as the only holy center in the entire world, right, from which any other providential thread derives, connected with other holy places, but that evidently having Rome like a common thread. And for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.